1 Samuel chapter 1. I love miracle stories, all right? I love miracle stories when God shows up in somebody's life and I see incredible things happen for them. I can remember when April and I were first Christians, we started going to church, and it was on a testimony service on a Wednesday night. It was the end of the year service, and it was a testimony service. And I remember one of the leaders in the church was a young man, him and his wife. He stood up and he gave a testimony about how in tithing, God just stretched the money and made it more. And he didn't, on paper, it didn't make sense. And he's saying all these things. And I'm like, that's really cool. And then when April and I started tithing, it was hard to pay the bills. It's like, oh, so it's like, oh, he said God would make it a bit more. He'd make more money. Well, look, if money's coming in, and really tithing is about prioritizing and about your trust. That's what it is. What he was saying is they always put the Lord first, and God always met the need. That's what he was saying. But I was going, well, maybe God doesn't love me like he loves him. That wasn't what the truth was. It's just kind of when miracle stories are happening for everybody else, or like when the kids go to youth camp and the girl's in there listening and she's dating some scandalous dude, some reckless dude who don't love Jesus. It's only trying to hit on her, trying to mess with her, trying to take something pure from her, that. And she hears a message about don't be missionary dating and you need to break up with that terrible person and blah, blah, blah. And they come back and break up with them. And then God brings the best looking Christian dude to them. It's like a 1 Corinthians 13 love story. It's like, that's so good. And then you're like, I need to break up with my terrible boyfriend, and then nobody asks you out on a date for 6 years, except Dumb and Dumber. Or a dude make a train take a dirt road, like a goofy looking sucker, like one of those things. You're like, why is God doing it for them, but he's not doing it for me? And I think that today, in this word to kind of encourage us, I think that one of the things we don't talk about a whole lot is we know, if you've been around church for any amount of time, we understand that God is good. We understand that God is great, that he can work miracles. He can do whatever he wants to, however he wants to, whenever he wants to. We know that God's a big God. But what we don't talk about a lot in the American church is how do we handle the emotions when we feel like God didn't show up for us? And the truth of it is there are times we feel that way. I mean, have you ever felt like God let you down? I'm not saying that he did. I'm saying you felt that way. A friend of mine, his senior year of high school, standout athlete, played on a state championship team. His dad is salt of the earth, light of the world, live his faith kind of guy. Going in for a heart cath. Well, it's such a minor procedure. He didn't even go to the hospital. They said, we don't want you to miss. You already missed enough school type thing. Just go and just come when you get out of school. And he comes up that day, as soon as he gets out of school, and when he's walking up to the room, everybody's running around crazy. His dad had just passed away. This simple procedure that was supposed to be, that happens hundreds of times a day in hospitals around our community. His dad loses his life that day. Now, can you imagine how he feels? My dad has loved you. My dad has served you. My dad has been faithful to your house. He's a giver. He goes above and beyond. I mean, everybody that knows him knows he's a man of God. How could you let this happen to him? And more than that, how could you let this happen to me? I love my dad. I want my dad there. Can you imagine? Do you think that he's justified to have those feelings? Now, you can say no all you want to, but you're lying to yourself if you think you're never going to be in a place where you question the timing and the situation. And if we don't talk about it, there's going to be a lot of confused believers that think that it's wrong to question or to have emotions like that. But I submit to you today that God is big enough to handle your why. God is big enough to handle it. It's in those situations. Maybe it's that baby you've always dreamed of, but it hasn't happened yet. Or the engagement that you've prayed for, but it's never come about. Or the loved one that is sick and you've been praying for healing and it's just not getting any better. You're disappointed. You're mad. And when you're disappointed and mad, there can begin to be a hardness that grows in your heart that creates a grudge. And we know we're supposed to trust and we know it's difficult. And why would God not take care of this? The truth is there's a lot of people that sit inside of church buildings that have been angry with God for a while because of something that's happened. And they don't know how to process the emotions of it. Now, I can tell you that I believe that God is going to use the moments that we have together because there's always a process through the pain that positions us for the purpose that we can share in that pain. Now, Samuel is a prophet that most of us would know was the one who anointed David to be the next king over Israel. Samuel was a mouthpiece for God to the nation. When they wanted a king, they went to Samuel. Samuel picked Saul because it was what man wanted. It was man's best pick. But God spoke to Samuel, said, I'm going to remove the mantle from Saul, and I want you to go find for me a king. And he said, I want you to find a man after my heart. And he goes and he finds David through a process. Samuel was a man who heard from God. Samuel was a man who spoke for God. He was the mouthpiece of God. It was an incredible opportunity for him in his life. But before he was ever the prophet, there was a process to this prophet. His dad's name was Elkanah. And you look in the first chapter of 1 Samuel and you see that Elkanah, when his name is translated, it simply means God has created a son. Now, he has 2 wives. And I know what some of you may think, like 2 wives. You don't want that. That's a whole lot of emotion. And with them 2 wives was a rivalry. His wife Hannah couldn't conceive, which is why most of them believe that he had a second wife, Elkanah. Now, Hannah couldn't bear children. And in Old Testament times, it was one of the biggest blessings that a wife could provide to a husband was to give a son to him, so the name would carry on. So Hannah feels like a failure. She feels ashamed. She feels useless. She might be arm candy for Elkanah, but she doesn't feel like she's fulfilling purpose for him. And each year, Elkanah would take the family to a place called Shiloh for worship and sacrifice. Now, Peninnah, who is the other woman, she took opportunity to throw shade on Hannah when they went. Let's look together in verses 6 and 7. It says, so Peninnah would taunt Hannah and make fun of her because the Lord kept her from having children. You're like, what kind of person does that? Peninnah, she did that. Year after year, it was the same. Peninnah would taunt Hannah as they went to the tabernacle. Each time, Hannah would be reduced to tears and would not even eat. That's pretty tore up. Hannah, sweet, godly. Peninnah is the girl your mama warned you about. Cruel, vicious. She may have been pretty, but she was mean. Mean as a cat on a leash. YouTube it. YouTube cat on a leash. It'll bless your life. And you'll understand why I talk about cats the way I do. Things is crazy. They'll hurt you. They're not man's best friend. I'm talking about Peninnah's mean, y'all. I mean, can you see how this can be confusing? Hannah, godly. Peninnah is an absolute witch. Mean. Cruel, taunting Hannah because of her womb is closed, taunting her to making her sick, and she has a baby. Could you see where Hannah would have these feelings of being confused? Like, why would God bless Peninnah with children but not Hannah? Because God could have given Hannah a child, but he didn't. It's that I'm faithful, I'm a good person, I love you, and I've honored you my whole life. She prayed, she believed, she waited, and year after year, nothing. Maybe you can relate. Year after year, praying for salvation in your family and it hadn't happened. Year after year, praying for healing and it hasn't happened. Year after year, praying that depression will no longer knock on your door, but it seems to turn around quickly on you. Year after year, praying and it doesn't feel like God hears you. You feel like God's doing something for everybody else but you. Now, it's not something we talk about very often, but the truth about it is the enemy works in the quietness of those seasons and makes you believe a lie. Each year, Elkanah takes them to this place of worship, and each year, this is what she feels. Each year, when you pray, my marriage is going to be great, and maybe you're still walking through some struggles, or you feel like this is the year financially where things are going to turn around and you experience a setback, or maybe you feel all alone and nobody else understands what's going on with you, but you have these feelings. God, where are you? Why haven't you? Or God, do you even care? You pray, believe, you wait. Now, Elkanah, the husband, generally a good man, but he has this one thing it's tough to get past that most of us men deal with. He loves his wife, but he asks stupid questions. I don't know if you've ever experienced this. I have not. I've heard stories. You come home from work. What'd you do all day? 3 kids running around crazy. Almost get you stabbed. What'd you do all day? Look, let me just give you, my wife was a hairdresser for years. Guys, whenever your wife or a lady you know does anything to her hair, don't you ever ask a question about it. Just say, oh, I like what you did. Even if you don't. Is that lying? No, that's self-defense, protection, whatever it may. You don't ever be like, did you mean to do that to your hair? Oh, that came out wrong. It's like, you don't ever, when there's these moments of seasons of highs and lows, like, hey, do you think your hormones are imbalanced? It's never good. It's never good. You can't be like, they make patches for that. It ain't good. Gets you on thin ice. So in verse 8, Elkanah says, why are you crying, Hannah? Like he's oblivious to the fact that she's been taunted. It's not like that Hannah's the only one that knows this is an issue. Why are you crying? Why aren't you eating? Why be downhearted just because you have no children? And then he says a really dumb thing. You have me. Isn't that better than having 10 sons? I believe Hannah at that moment had this. You want to rephrase that question? You're going to want to ask that a different way. Yes, I love you, but I want to give you a son. It doesn't mean I don't love you. It's just what I want. I want to be able to do this. But God seems to withhold. Isn't that better than having 10 sons? And her rival, Peninnah, is making her miserable. And her husband has got the foot and mouth disease. And what happens? Hannah then unloads on God. Verse 9. Once after a sacrificial meal at Shiloh, Hannah got up and went to pray. Eli the priest was sitting at his customary place beside the entrance of the tabernacle, and Hannah was in deep anguish, crying bitterly as she prayed to the Lord. Hannah pours her heart out to God. Can I tell you, God can handle your hurt. He handled it for David. He handled it for Jeremiah. He handled it for Jesus. If there's any way that this cup be passed from me, nevertheless, not mine, but yours, be done. My God, why have thou forsaken me? Was it because God didn't care, or was there a process through this pain? So Hannah is experiencing this, and God can handle the hurt. She goes and she's crying bitterly, praying to the Lord. And it's this moment where we have to understand and identify that God understands our pain. He understands it. He sees it, he identifies with it, and he empathizes with our pain. And you know what else? God welcomes our questions. He welcomes our questions. Why? Because God's the only one that knows the answer to the reason. He's the only one that really knows the answer to the question. Your gossiping friend really doesn't know. Your good-intentioned family member really doesn't know. They will give you all kinds of terrible advice because they're blinded by your feelings, and God is not shaken by the very thing that shakes you. When you cry bitterly to the Lord, God, why did you let this happen? He's not like, oh, they're mad. Oh, I don't know what to do with mad people. Oh, I better go hide off the throne for a minute. No, he's right there. I am God. Can you imagine if Job had not been able to question? And he finally responded, where were you? God's not shaken by the things that shake us. He's still God. He can handle our questions. He's big enough to handle our questions. He's big enough to handle whatever we ask of him, whatever we want. He's big enough to handle it. Why? Because God would rather have us yell at him than walk away from him. We were doing worship. Our team was doing worship years ago at a youth camp, and the speaker was there, and he was shucking the corn, throwing it down, whatever, bringing it, all that. And he could preach. He could preach like a house of fire. He's just super anointed. He was telling a story how this guy came up to him and said, man, I want a double portion of what you have. He said, you want a double portion of what I have, but you don't want to walk where I've walked to get it. He said, do you want to hold your lifeless daughter in your arms? Is that what you're willing to do to get it? Don't want what somebody else has because you don't understand what they've had to go through to get it. He tells a story of his daughter laying lifeless. They take her to the hospital and she gets sick and she passes away and she lays lifeless in his arms. He's preaching, he's serving. God had radically changed his life. Before this, he got married, had children. Daughter passes away. And now he's from up north, so he says things that don't nearly translate just the same to us. He said, I was laying there I was in that hospital with my lifeless daughter in my arms, and I cussed God out. Now, everybody's like, ooh, he cussed God. When he says cuss God out, it means he yelled at God. He gave God a piece of his mind. He didn't use vulgarity. Everybody else was freaked out in the place like, ooh, he said he cussed at God. What he was saying is he had an honest conversation. Do you know the only one that could speak and bring peace to that man? God. Not his wife, not his brother, not his father, not his best friend that he had done ministry with for years. He needed Jesus to step out in the fourth watch of the night when the winds and the waves were wreaking havoc and say, peace be still. That's what he needed. That's why God's big enough to handle the questions. Because God would rather you scream at him like this as long as you end up like this. God's big enough to handle our why. I want you to know that we have to talk to somebody that has the answer. I don't understand why everything happens. I don't know exactly why families walk through tragedy. I can't give you a perfect answer, but what I can tell you is I'd rather walk through the darkest tragedy on this earth holding Jesus' hand than to not have that option. I would rather walk with him. I would rather be mad. I would rather process it with Jesus than I would with anybody else. Why? Because he's big enough to handle it. I have a real close friend that was in a ministry I was a part of. His mom loved Jesus. I mean, loved Jesus for real. Senior year, she passed us away from cancer. Now, do you think that if I went up to that young man and said, hey, buddy, everything happens for a reason, how do you think that's going to go over? If I lose someone that way, you walk up and tell me that, it's not going to be a good day. I will rebuke you back to where you came from. I don't want to hear your cheesy pickup line of, oh, everything happens for a reason. Your loved one passed away tragically. Oh, all things work. I know that God's in control. I don't need your cheap excuse to try and make me feel better. Presence is the language during pain, not your words. I want to talk to Jesus about it. God, how could you let this happen? That individual shut everybody out. Didn't want to talk to nobody. Why? Because he believed God was going to heal his mama. He believed God was going to heal his mama. His mama loved Jesus. His mama was a saint of God. He shut himself off. Wouldn't answer phone calls. Wouldn't answer texts. Wouldn't come to church. I drove over to his house and sit in his front yard. Waited for him to get out of school. When I love you, it's hard for you to ignore me. And I knew he was hurting. And I wasn't going to go over there and be like, it's ridiculous you're not coming to church. No, no, no. I don't pretend to understand everything he's walking through. I can tell you what I know he needed. He needed somebody to just be there. I put him in the car and made him ride almost 3 hours with me one way. I had to run an errand. It was one of the turning points. Because my encouragement was simply, when you walk through it, walk with Jesus. And it's going to come out on the other end. I don't know why. I couldn't give you the reasons. I couldn't speak. I don't know. I don't know why. But I can tell you this. Let's go to Jesus who does. I mean, you understand why Scripture says, oh, death, where is your sting? Hell, where is your victory? No disease on this earth will have the final word. But he was walking through pain. That's that cry bitterly to the Lord. Hannah tells God, give me a son and I'll give him back to you. As she was praying, the priest Eli saw her lips moving, but there was no sound coming out. He accused her of being drunk. She said, I'm not drunk. I'm praying out of deep anguish and sorrow. And I don't know if you've ever had a moment in your life where you were so broken that you were with every ounce in you praying and crying out to God, and you were sobbing, but no words were coming out. Your mouth was moving, but there was nothing coming out. I can tell you, if you've never experienced in this life, you will. This life you will experience. You will walk through a hard challenge. You will walk through some type of tragedy. I don't want it to happen, but we live in a fallen world, and this is the message the American church is missing because they've been told, if you come to Jesus, you'll never have another tough day in your life, and that's not the gospel. The gospel is, on your toughest day, God's still good. On your worst day and your worst tragedy, God is the strength that'll bring you through it. I don't know why God heals some and doesn't heal. I don't know why, but I know this. Heaven is no cheap reward for those that love God. So does it make sense that people can struggle? And that God says, bring me your pain. Bring me your questions. There's nothing wrong with that. I was always kind of taught that you don't question God. Well, I'm not going to freak God out if I do. I have real conversations with Jesus. Just this past week, something happened. I'm like, well, I know people that are doing, how could this be? We're just trying to love you. We're just trying to do the right thing. Because the devil is always messing with the direction that God is trying to take people. I know that, but I was still mad about it. Do you know what? God would rather me have an honest conversation with him than to call you and dump it out on you. I'm your friend. I'm glad you're my friend. I think it's good. I'm thankful we're friends and we can have honest conversation, but I would not rather have honest conversation with you without having honest conversation with Jesus. He's big enough to handle our questions. God, why? Why? I mean, then Eli, after she says that, after she prays in deep anguish, Eli says, go in peace. May God grant your request. You would think at that moment, she's like, oh, I'm pregnant. Oh, no. Kids in the room, so we understand that's not how that works. There's a process. And there's one of these things that she gets this word from the priest Eli. She walks out, and she still got nothing. She's still dealing with Penina. Her husband still says stupid junk. And God still hasn't given her a sign to her prayer. But she continues to hold on to her faith and doesn't let go. Fix your eyes on verse 19. It's so good. It says the entire family got up early the next morning and went to worship the Lord once more. Can I tell you, a waiting season is never a wasted season with the Lord. She got up the next morning when she had no sign, no inkling that this was going to happen, and she went to worship the Lord once more. Isn't it wonderful that even though you're struggling through a process, you can still go worship Jesus? A waiting season is never a wasted season. In the waiting, God is always working. Second part of that verse says, then they returned home to Ramah. And when Elkanah slept with Hannah, the Lord remembered her plea, and in due time she gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, for she said, I asked the Lord for him. Listen to me. God's delays are not always God's denials. Just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean God isn't in control. She unloaded on God and she told God the truth. She poured her heart out in anguish and in sorrow, and she went and worshiped again. Can I tell you, worship is the key to victory. And there's a difference between praise and worship. Praise is thanking God for what he's done. Worship says, if you never do another thing for me, you're still God. It's easy for me to praise God for the things I have. But if I had not another thing and it was all gone, would I still worship him? Hannah did, y'all. Hannah went in there and worshiped in Shiloh with a woman who taunted her because of her inability. That's why you don't have to be distracted by people that talk smack about you, that taunt you, that try to hurt you or speak negativity over you. They don't get the final word. And even your well-intentioned spouse doesn't get the final word. Or in due season, what God has promised will not delay. Now, I don't understand the timing always, but I know that God works it out. She unloaded on God, and she worshiped God once more. And in that season, they returned. The promise that Eli said to her came to pass in due time, and she gave a son named Samuel. And Samuel will be documented as one of the greatest prophets. There's always a process. You read like, oh, I bet you, Samuel's parents didn't go through anything. You never know what somebody's gone through to get to where they are. There's a process with your life. Embrace the process, because I can tell you, you know what Hannah didn't become once she had that baby? A woman who taunted another woman who was barren. There are several families in our church that have walked through seasons like that, and God opened up. You know what they'll never do? Speak death over someone else. Don't you understand that pain is a universal language that needs no interpretation? I don't have time today to tell you all the painful things I've walked through that gives me identification with you, and we can connect and go, man, he's been through what I've been through. We've all gone through something. And do you know who brings us through it? Jesus. He brings us through. And I would tell you that we worship once more.